When the COVID pandemic first hit the globe, the manufacturing plants in China had to be shut down as a precautionary measure. This was the first hit to the global supply chain. Similar disruptions soon spread across the globe, affecting both manufacturers and the logistic companies that ship, store, and deliver their goods. The end result was a disruption to the entire global supply chain, from raw materials to delivery of the finished product to the end customer. Welcome to the Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we are talking about the global supply chain, the history, and its evolution over a period of time. In ancient times, transportation technology was basic, and the cost of moving goods was a very important determinant. So when it came to the production and distribution of products, the products were usually kept close to the source of the raw material. And when finished, the products made their way in a largely linear chain to their end consumer. Ancient trade routes like the Silk Road through Central Asia and the spice route over the Indian Ocean were mostly linear chains that took a finished product to its ultimate destination. And given the high costs, long-distance trade was limited to high-value items like spices, weapons, and luxury products. Outside of the high-value items, the production and consumption of most items was local. This meant that the producer and the consumer could directly communicate with each other, and the customers could specify exactly what they wanted. This was the world of the village weaver, the potter, the blacksmith, and the cobbler, the bulk of the pre-industrial artisan manufacturing, and therefore it was customized to the needs of the end consumer. Yes, in ancient times, manufacturing was a lot more customer-centric than in the early 20th century. The core issue, as we said, of the supply chain staying local was the lack of an economical way to transport products across the globe. And it was only in the 18th century that shipping technology improved enough to allow large-scale movement of the supply chain. And the first product to be put together with a truly global supply chain network was rum. Yes, rum, the alcoholic drink. Slave labor was imported from West Africa to the Caribbean to grow sugarcane, which was imported from India, and the sugarcane molasses were then shipped to New England, where distilleries in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Staten Island turned it into rum. Some of the drink was consumed locally, but most of it was sold in bottles and barrels in Europe and all over the Atlantic. At that time, the distillation of rum was the single biggest industry in colonial America. Along with the improvement in shipping technology in the 18th century, the Industrial Revolution also took shape in late 18th century. And as a result of this, production networks took on a totally different scale. The cotton industry was the center of this shift. Prior to the technological innovations of the Industrial Revolution, India was the cotton manufacturing center of the world, and it exported its textiles all over the world. Competition from imported cotton was a major cause of resentment for the traditional wool industry in Britain. By the 18th century, the British middle class had become more concerned with cleanliness and fashion, and there was a demand for easily washable and colorful cotton fabrics. Wool continued to dominate the European markets, but cotton prints were introduced to Britain by East India Company in the 1690s. Import of calicos, the cheap cotton fabrics from Calicut in India, found a mass market among the poor in Britain. And by 1721, these calicos threatened British manufacturers, so much so that Parliament passed the Calico Act that banned calicos for clothing or domestic purposes. But Indian cotton textiles, particularly those from Bengal, continued to maintain a competitive advantage up until the 19th century. And in order to compete with India, Britain invested in labor saving techniques while implementing protectionist policies such as bans and tariffs to restrict Indian imports. Yeah, you heard it right. As the global supply chain opened, tariffs and bans came into place. But right around this time, another major event took place. The East India Company found a footing in India, and that opened a new market for British goods. After its conquest of Bengal in 1757, the East India Company invested a lot of the wealth gained in British industries such as textile manufacturing. British colonization also opened the large Indian market to British goods, which could be sold in India now without tariffs or duties. But the biggest economic impact that happened to India was the negative supply chain that the British created for the cotton textiles industry towards India. Negative supply chain. Wait, what's that? Well, the British imported raw cotton from India without tariffs to the British factories, which manufactured textiles from Indian cotton, giving Britain a monopoly over India's large market and cotton resources. And the finished cotton textiles were then sold back to the Indian market. So India served both as a significant supplier of raw products to the British manufacturers and also a large captive market for British manufactured goods. So from a manufacturer of the finished textile product and creator of capital, India became a net raw material producer for the advanced British industry. Eventually, Britain surpassed India as the world's largest cotton textile manufacturer towards the late 19th century. Over the next century, transportation technology witnessed major breakthroughs that included railways, trams, bicycles, and the most significant among them all, the Suez Canal. And by the time of World War I, the Panama Canal also had been constructed. And as a result, the cost of transporting goods dropped sharply. Ocean freight rates, for instance, fell 70% between 1840 and 1910. Then there was the invention of the internal combustion engine, and cars became more prominent in the late 19th century. And the next evolution in transportation was the use of trucks for transportation via road. And when it came to storage, the development of pellets from 1925 onwards was a big boon for warehouses, and this allowed more storage within the warehouses. So with all these developments, improvement in transportation, optimization of shipping, mass manufacturing really ramped up. And as a result, it was no longer possible for individual customers to specify requirements. So interestingly, as technology improved, customization became less prevalent. The supply chain responded by standardizing products, and ultimately even downstream distribution networks became standardized. And this shift is best summarized by Henry Ford's famous comment, "Customers can have any car they want as long as it is black." And then transportation went through another major innovation, containerization. Sometimes we tend to ignore the importance of this innovation, but it was a radical idea. Until the 1950s, ships had to be manually loaded piece by piece. Industrial cables had to be carefully stacked next to boxes of delicate porcelain and perhaps a basket containing fruit. This was time consuming, and it was also very expensive. So the cost of port handling accounted for almost half of the transportation cost of shipping. The system was prone to breakage and theft, and shipments getting lost was not uncommon. And once shipments got lost, it was very difficult to trace them. So, with the introduction of containerization, logistics in general underwent a huge change. The containers standardized the loading and distribution process. So, the containers could not merely be sealed and loaded into ships, but they could also be seamlessly passed on to the truck and rail network to transport after they landed in the seaports. So, the 1970s onwards, most of the ships had the ability to support containers. And these ships could carry 4 times the cargo of traditional ships. They were faster and were more efficient with respect to loading and unloading, and this allowed them to make around 6 round trips a year between Europe and the Far East, compared to 3.5 round trips for the older ships. Now, Western countries persisted with building old-style seaports well into the 1970s. They already had a large existing fleet and other infrastructure from the pre-container era, and they didn't want to easily move to the container era. And because of this, Asia, which wholeheartedly adopted containerization and built large new facilities, ended up becoming a hub for shipping and transportation. Hong Kong and Singapore, and later China, asserted themselves as the major ports and clearinghouses for containerized shipping and ended up becoming the world's largest container ports by 1990. Now, the improvement in the shipments, along with improvement in communication via telephones and fax, led to the next shift in the supply chain network. Improved communication meant that it was possible to exactly specify components and products, and containerization meant that these components could be transported cheaply and delivered just in time. And all these developments meant that it was no longer critical to have the source of the raw material close to the point of production, or have the point of production not too far away from the final point of consumption. And one of the first companies to take advantage of this newer network was the US-based toy manufacturer Mattel, which used it to produce the Barbie doll. The earliest Barbie factories were in Japan and Taiwan, and today it is put together by a complex network spanning the world. With the concept of just-in-time becoming a reality, Japan jumped onto the bandwagon before anybody else and brought about a fundamental change in its production systems and called it lean production. So the Japanese production systems became more flexible and sharply reduced the need to carry inventory. So as the supply chain evolved more and more into a globalized supply chain, the electronics industry turned out to be very well suited for this globalized supply chain. So an example of this is the production of Apple's iPhone and iPad. The iPhone is made up of inputs sourced from around the world, but these are then assembled together by Foxconn in China. And the product never passes through any Apple facility during the production, but Apple receives about 66% of the price, whereas Foxconn, the final assembler, receives a paltry 2.5%. The other interesting aspect of Apple's iPhone is that Samsung is a major supplier of the iPhone's components, even though it competes directly with Apple. So earlier in the program, we talked about Western countries persisting with old-style ports, whereas the Asian economies were building state-of-the-art port facilities. But why? Well, when it comes to trade and economics, first world infrastructure with third world labor is a dream combination for any global business. And when China started booming in the 90s, that was the combination it offered to the world. Wait, so with transportation costs down, was cheap labor the primary factor? that made China the manufacturing hub? Well, maybe the primary factor, but not the only factor. Well, around this time, there were certain trade practices and regulations that Western nations enforced upon the businesses to comply with. And these included areas like environmental compliance and minimum wages to be paid to workers. These were leading to an increased cost of doing business in the advanced economies. And China, with very little requirements for environmental compliance, as well as completely lax labor laws, was an ideal choice. And the labor laws were so lax that the cheapest form of labor available was child labor. And between 2001 and 2013, the United States lost about 3.2 million jobs to China. The hardest hit was the computer and electronic parts industry, which lost about 1.25 million jobs. So, what is the current global supply chain crisis all about? Well, for starters, it started as a logistics problem. With the outbreak of the pandemic in early 2020, the assumption was that global demand would drop drastically. But what was expected to be a drop ended up being a surge when consumers shifted channels from physical stores to online stores. Between April and June of 2020, during the first wave of the virus, Amazon sold about 57% more items than it had done a year earlier. And as this demand surged, a wave of factory goods swiftly overwhelmed US ports. The ports on the US West Coast, notably Los Angeles and Long Beach, since these ports lacked capacity, the container ships ended up waiting in long queues, waiting to get unloaded. And even when these were unloaded, the containers continued to pile up on the docks because of a shortage of truck drivers. The truck drivers usually hauled the cargo to the warehouses, and because of COVID, there was an acute shortage of truck drivers. And hiring all of a sudden became the big logistics problem with respect to the global supply chain. Now, while the demand was surging globally, one industry where the demand was really surging exponentially was the semiconductor industry. As more and more industries across the globe have started building smart products like self-driving cars or smart cameras, the global demand for chips has been increasing. But the paradigm of just-in-time essentially entails that you maintain minimum inventory and you are manufacturing to order, which means that you rarely have spare capacity to crank up production if there is a sudden surge in demand. And that is exactly what has led to the shortage of semiconductor chips across the globe. This is truly a supply chain problem because 70% of the world's semiconductors are manufactured by two companies in East Asia, Taiwan's TSMC and South Korea's Samsung. And what makes matters worse is that there are high entry barriers into semiconductor manufacturing. There's a steep learning curve required to set up a semiconductor foundry, and it usually entails an upfront investment of about 10 to 12 billion US dollars. TSMC has been looking at ways to meet the surge in demand, and it is looking to building a semiconductor factory with Sony in Japan to provide chips for cameras, cars, and other purposes. But this really begs the question, is it time to diversify the supply chain? Is just in time not the right paradigm for high value, high demand industries like semiconductors? 9 out of the top 10 busiest ports in the world are in East Asia. This alone should be a cause for alarm with respect to the diversification of the global supply chain. And China's zero COVID policy has not helped ease the supply chain pressures. So one of the most important lessons learned out of the pandemic must be the importance of a diverse global supply chain. And on that note, we end this section of the program. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. Which nation's Supreme Court in 1928 ruled that women were not persons, so they were ineligible for appointment to the Senate? In 1928, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that women were not persons according to the British North American Act of 1867. So the answer is C, Canada. Question for the current episode. 9 out of the top 10 busiest ports in the world are in East Asia. Which one is the only non-East Asian port in the top 10? Is it A, Jebel Ali, Dubai, B, Antwerp, Belgium, C, Los Angeles, USA, or D, Rotterdam, the Netherlands? Once again, 9 out of the top 10 busiest ports in the world are in East Asia. Which one is the only non-East Asian port in the top 10? A, Jebel Ali, Dubai, B, Antwerp, Belgium, C, Los Angeles, USA, or D, Rotterdam, the Netherlands? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in today's episode. In the next episode, we look at some of the major economic crises that the world has faced through the 20th and the 21st centuries, their origins, and what led to the final recovery. Till then, stay safe and keep looking for the why in history.